Hello, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. The rise of the second Trump administration has kind of meant the relaunch of protest. Not that protests went anywhere, but it seems to be much more prevalent right now. People are hitting the streets, they're signing statements, they're attending rallies. And for people, especially for mainline Protestants and progressive evangelicals, many of them can see the importance of social justice, especially right now. But at times they may forget that it's just as important to focus on the spiritual aspect of their faith as it is to focus on the justice aspect of their faith. My guest today is Wes Granberg-Michelson. And he says that if one sees justice as an important part of their faith, they also have to make spirituality a priority as well. Before we go into that conversation, a little bit about Wes. He was a legislative assistant to Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon, also a director of Church and Society for the World Council of Churches, and for 17 years, he was the general secretary of the Reformed Church in America. He has a new book out called The Soul Work of Justice that we will talk about in this discussion. So, without further ado, here is my conversation with Wes Granberg-Michelson. Well, welcome to the podcast. And I wanted to start by kind of helping, getting to know a little bit more about you, your kind of spiritual biography, and also a little bit about kind of, your biography and then also some of your work background.
Going back to when I was 4 years old with my wonderful mother, raised in a strong evangelical home. And I was asking her questions of faith, and as an inquisitive 4-year-old, and she asked me if I wanted to accept Jesus into my heart. And I thought about it, and I knew I was going to a dentist appointment. And so I said to her, well, maybe, but why don't we do that after I go to the dentist, Mom? And she looked at me and she said, well, Jesus could come again while you're in the dentist chair. So that was both the sincerity and also the intensity of the kind of faith I grew up with, a strong evangelical home in the suburbs of Park Ridge, in Park Ridge, Illinois, suburbs of Chicago. Went to a high school of 4,000 kids in which there was not one single person of color. Mm-hmm. So I was in a very isolated kind of environment, a conservative, Republican, evangelical, white world. My parents wanted me to go to Wheaton College, which was their alma mater, well known as kind of the evangelical Harvard. I decided through the influence of my young life leader, I wanted to go to Hope College in Holland, Michigan. And that was really the beginning of broadening my faith to understand it wasn't just about Jesus and me. It was also about God and the world. And that we learned to put together both the Word and the world. And this was happening right in the middle, Dennis, of the Civil Rights Movement and of the Vietnam War. And I went on to Princeton Seminary with a real desire to figure out how does this faith that I had learned as in my childhood fit to what I see going on in the world. So I had the opportunity after I'd started seminary to work as an intern in D.C. in the office of Senator Mark Hatfield. He was an evangelical. Well, being an evangelical back then is different than what you say now. He was progressive. He was anti-war and one of the leading anti-war figures. And it was a real calling to work with them. That went on for 10 years in a very deep relationship. But when I started looking for a church in D.C. I went to Fourth Presbyterian, which anyone from D.C. knows, really well-established evangelical church in Bethesda. Heard a lot of good things about Jesus, didn't hear anything about the war or civil rights. I went to the Episcopal Church on the Hill, heard a lot of good preaching about justice and peace and the war, and didn't hear very much about Jesus. And finally, I discovered the Church of the Savior, which was an ecumenical church founded by Gordon Cosby. Elizabeth O'Connor wrote books about it. And that introduced me to the inward and outward journey together. It kind of brought those two aspects of faith together for me and really determined the future trajectory of my life. And vocationally, I eventually left D.C. I went into the ministry, worked at the World Council of Churches in Geneva, Switzerland on issues of integrity of creation. Was called to be what they call general secretary of my denomination, the Reformed Church of America, which had me, trying to figure out how you make a denomination work and its ecumenical commitments. Remain very engaged ecumenically. And for the last 10 years, my wife and I have been living in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and writing and also pastoring here.
Okay. There are two things that are kind of DC related that I had in this conversation. The first is I was in DC in the mid 1990s and had a lot of connection with Church of the Savior. So when you said that and in our talking, that kind of picked that up, that I went to a lot of their classes and I thought they were really helpful because I think they found a balance between both spirituality and social justice that is, even today, is not always found as much. And then the second thing is that I actually remember there was an event one time I was at in the Methodist building, which is across the street from the Capitol. Yep. And actually, one of the people who spoke there was Mark Hatfield, who is someone that I really found fascinating just because he was kind of an odd duck. And I mean that in a very good way, that he was just someone that was a different sort of politician that you just don't find these days. And so having him not around I think, has made the world a little bit poorer for that.
Well, if you thought he was an odd duck then, think of what a progressive evangelical and a liberal Republican would feel like today.
Oh, it would be a very, very, very odd duck. Yeah. Exactly.
His model, his life, it was remarkable. In fact, Randall Balmer, who's the noted religious historian of American history, is writing a biography about him.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He sent me the text. It's going to be published by Urban's. Probably won't be out to the end of the year, but it's really going to make an important contribution to, especially in today's political and religious climate.
Yeah, I think that will be something that will be very important to read and for people to hear. Is about his life, because I think it's influential, and I think especially for evangelicals, it's important to have that voice, to hear that story. So one of the reasons I have you on the podcast is because you kind of hinted about it when you were looking for a church in DC, is your book, The Soul Work of Justice. And when you talk about the importance of spirituality, of faith, as well as social justice, and how you kind of need one to feed the other. Could you kind of give a little bit of a synopsis of what led you to write the book and what is the book about?
Sure. Well, one of the things I learned at Church of the Savior was forms of spiritual life and development that were fresh and were deeper. And that included silent prayer. It included forms of retreat, that weren't just going out having a good time like I did in my church youth group, but actually spending time alone and in quiet and in contemplation. Also journaling, using journaling as a spiritual tool. And I began doing that. And for me and my personality, it really helped. Keeping a journal, as I learned it from people like Elizabeth O'Connor and many others, it's really a place to process the pain and the grace in your life and to deal with it and to deal with God in that, to be in dialogue and to look at yourself and look at the questions you ask and look at your experiences of God, or sometimes wondering where God was. But being able to write that out in ways that, at least for some people, certainly for me, really become therapeutic and really become spiritually grounding. And so I've done that for my life and my various ministries. And during COVID, I was sitting here in my home with my wife, Karen, and she looked up at this bookcase that has all the journals I've kept. She says, "What are you ever going to do with those?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, why don't you, it's COVID. Why don't you read them through and see if there's anything there that our two kids might want to read?" So I decided to start that. I started reading through 50 years of these journals. So it took me a year. I started, pulling out something that, oh my gosh, now that's interesting. Now that's really useful and so forth. And by the end of the time, I know my spiritual director had said to me, if you do this, this isn't going to be an intellectual exercise. You're going to be drawn back into all those journey points, occurrences, pivotal points that, you'll kind of relive them and internalize. That was really true. And I thought, well, I've got something here to share with, my two kids and others, but, there's something deeper here, I think. And so I talked to a friend who had been an agent with one of the previous books I've written. And she went through this stuff and she says, "Wes, you have to write this. You've got stuff here that can be really helpful, especially when today the urgency of action and witness externally is so great, because we're in such a mess, in my view, Dennis, such a dark time. But being able to undergird that with spiritual depth and integrity that allows for real truth speaking and doesn't have us just in continual reaction, and that gives us the ability to in it for the long term. That's what I felt so urgently about. And so I wrote The Soul Work of Justice, really hoping it would be a help to any of us who are pastors or activists or leaders of organizations. I mean, it's particularly those who kind of know, we need to be out there. We need to be in the streets. We need to be clear about our witness to the gospel in this time, but we've got to do that from a depth of spiritual integrity and life that both sustains it, gives us resilience, and gives it real power and truth. And so that's really what the book is about, and how I developed it, and 4 different movements and the kind of stuff we have to deal with in the process.
What was I may say this, what led you to do journaling, and how did that help you and sustain you in your own activism?
Yeah. What led me into journaling was a workshop at Church of the Savior when I was kind of exploring membership there. Mm-hmm. And look, I was raised with an evangelical kind of piety, and I'm grateful for it. But it was have your quiet time every day, and then read some portion of the Bible and underline it with a pen, and and then pray to God, making kind of a list of the things you'd like God to do. It's sort of, the things we want to add to God's to-do list, which is already pretty long. And okay, I value those things, but Dennis, I came to a point where I really needed something more, something that had more depth and frankly, that looked more deeply into myself and looked more deeply into the questions we all have about God. And journaling was one of the tools that really allowed me to do that, because I'd write about the things I was experiencing, about my struggles, my disappointments, my certain epiphanies, certain times when I felt in some inexplicable way God's presence and love has just broken through to me. Maybe for an instant, maybe in just one encounter, but suddenly all of life becomes more vivid and real. And what does that mean? And then I began going on retreats. I try to take one day a month, and then each year a more extended one. But every time I went on one of those retreats, I'd read what I had written in the journal since the last time I was on retreat. What that would do is would just bring back into my awareness where my journey had been and where it was going, and the things that I needed to be attentive to. So journaling is for different people according to your personality and gifts. It may resonate more with some than others. For me, it really worked. The main thing is that all of us have to develop some kind of a spiritual infrastructure. I call that in the book a holding space. We've got to develop some discipline that allows us to take a step away from all the immediate pressures of our life and be at a point where we can be more deeply grounded, allowing for the real presence and love of God to break in anew. Because the way I experience it, when that love encounters you deeply and you let it flow, it then connects you to all those places of the world's deepest pain and suffering. It breeds the deepest kind of solidarity. So it's not just a solidarity of ideology or a solidarity of slogans, but it's a solidarity of love. And particularly in today's environment, that's the kind of solidarity we need.
I'm reminded there is someone else that I follow on Substack, and is Tony Robinson, who is a UCC pastor.
Oh, yeah.
And he shares in a recent Substack about his experience also during the civil rights movement. And I think it was in an African-American church, and how he and friends were just raring to go out there, and they were basically like, sit down. We need to worship right now. This is important. Yeah. And, he reflects on that decades later, and sees how important that is, that you needed that, and how the civil rights movement was very much grounded in that it was grounded in worship. And before you went out into the streets, that was where you started, was in prayer and in worship to God. And I think he talks about that because it can be so tempting to just think that worship doesn't have anything to do with,
right, exactly,
with what's going on in the world. And for him, it was, no, that he learned, this matters.
Yep. And unfortunately, a lot of worship we experience doesn't have anything to do with us, what's going on.
Unfortunately, yeah.
But I think you're exactly right about the civil rights movement, and I think that's generally forgotten. I know even on Substack, on Church and Main, you've written some very powerful things about the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, and capturing the essence that was there. There's also kind of a related story that I mentioned in the book, but it's about Desmond Tutu. Mm-hmm. And so it's during the anti-apartheid struggle. Desmond, of course, it's playing a key role. And Desmond, learns, I don't know if he's on a trip or whatever, but that in California, there are a group of nuns in a monastery who are getting up every morning early, and as was their discipline, and they were praying for the end of apartheid. They were praying for the anti-apartheid. And so he's back in South Africa, and there's this really stressful moment where he's in the cathedral and he's preaching, and those in the cathedral are ready to go out and march, but the cathedral is surrounded by South African police.
Mm-hmm.
And so Desmond goes out there in front of them, and he addresses the police, and he says, "Do you know that in California, a group of nuns are getting up every morning to pray for the end of apartheid? You don't stand a chance." And that, I mean, and that brings energy and conviction to those who are involved.
It does. Well, and I think that is the thing that we carry, I think, as Christians, is that we know that we have a power that's greater than the police. And that's and prayer can be a powerful thing if we can see it, because obviously apartheid did fall and those prayers were answered.
Yeah.
So, what do you have to say? Because I think, as I said earlier, there are people who will think that, and it's not without reason, that people will think, well, worship doesn't really have anything to say with what's going on in the world, or, prayer has nothing to say with what's going on in the world. We need to be out doing action. How do you kind of counter that, or help people to see that these two things are connected and that you can't really sustain one without the other?
Well, in two ways. I'll first talk about prayer, and then I'll talk about what I think and hope can happen in worship. And partly that's based on experience that it so happens that right now my wife and I, here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, we were asked, we've been living here about a decade, but we were asked recently to help this small ELCA congregation, Lutheran congregation, that's kind of struggling. Their pastor had to retire.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly we find ourselves in the pulpit and doing the sacraments, every Sunday. And so that means when I answer these questions, it's pretty existential now. It's not just some idea. But to start with prayer, I like to remind people of what prayer really can do. And I like to do that by reminding us of how distracted we always are, how there is so much information coming at us, so much that we can't possibly to digest, but yet it's coming to us in social media. It's coming to us, every day on our phones. And then when you get into it, you realize these are designed in order to rivet our attention, because that's how money's made. And
mm-hmm.
It does that, especially by emotions of fear and anger. And in fact, some people say it's really an economy of rage. The more anger you get people, whether they're on the right or the left, the more engaged they're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we live in what some people call an attention economy. And the problem is that attention is a limited commodity. There's only so much of it to go around. So you have to pay attention to where you give attention. Now here, prayer, Henry Nouwen, I think, is the one who first told me this. Prayer is attention. Prayer is attention. And so one can think about prayer in all the ways that we understand it, but as that practice that keeps us detached in a healthy way from the onslaught of what's happening, in order that we can be attached more deeply to God's presence and God's love and God's desires. There's a similar way, excuse me, to think about it. You could also say prayer is detachment from the fruit of your actions. And you think about that. Prayer is detachment from the fruit of your actions, meaning you act with all the power and conviction that you can. But when you do that, you then have to let it go. You have to feel, I've offered this up to God, but I'm not in charge of what happens. I'm not going to be able to manipulate and strategize. I've got to have that ability to stand back and let whatever God's Spirit intends happen. And I think prayer also does that. Now, when it comes to worship, I talk with pastors, and I think every Sunday when I'm going to preach, how do you deal with the gospel, with preaching in this time? And especially, you may have a purple congregation. I know all kinds of pastors who, half their congregation voted for Trump and half voted for Harris, and there are all these divisions, and so a pastor just wants to stay away from it. And then pastors struggle with, I don't want to be political. Well, look, all you have to do is preach the text, because it's all there. I mean, when if you really, you go through Advent, you go through now, if you're following the lectionary, we're in these passages about, this coming Sunday is the Beatitudes, for goodness sake.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a manifesto. This is a manifesto of a changed society. The Magnificat, and the fact that Jesus was living in the under the domination of a Roman Empire, and that when Jesus preaches about the kingdom of God, this isn't some magical spiritual thing. He's talking about a kingdom of God that is different than the kingdom that's there now.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're in a sacramental tradition, where you celebrate like you celebrate communion or the Lord's Supper, I mean, my goodness, you're celebrating those moments when the material things of the world become transformed through the inbreaking power of God's presence. And those moments teach us that what happens then also happens when we're in the world. So I think, Dennis, those are the ways I know for, you really have to rethink what it is when we talk about prayer, and rethink what happens when we're in worship, and get to the heart of those things, because then they will intersect directly with what's happening in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, that's what you said reminds me of something about Karl Barth, and how he preached and taught, especially during the rise of the Third Reich. And I've heard somewhere that he very seldom really talked about Hitler. He basically preached the gospel. Mm-hmm. That was enough. And in fact, that got him in trouble.
Yeah.
That sometimes, you don't have to basically talk necessarily directly about what things are going, because it's in the Bible. It's there. And that's enough.
I've been really struck by how much the message of the gospel itself, and you of course you could go back to the passages in the Hebrew Scriptures where you have similar things, but these days I'm really focusing on the life of Jesus,
mm-hmm.
on how much what he says and does really can speak to our own context today. I think, and when the early Christians and in the New Testament, when you say Jesus is Lord, what is that in contrast to? Well, it's very simple. It's in contrast to Caesar as Lord.
Yep. Yeah.
Because that's what was going on. And I think it was Tertullian or someone said, if everything is Caesar's, nothing is God's. Mm-hmm. And those are the kinds of questions that you certainly don't have to be partisan to put those questions of the gospel in front of the congregation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to kind of get practical here for a moment, because of course, where I'm recording this from is from Minneapolis, and of course that's kind of in the news lately. And so my question would be for people, for Christians that are here, is what advice would you give them for them to be spiritually grounded at this time?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a great question, and before I answer it, I've also got to say, I mean, I have close friends who are pastors who are there, and I have utmost respect for them. I mean, one's not, yes, pastors who are like yourself who are in Minneapolis, St. Paul, but others who have traveled there, and whom I've heard from. I'll tell you, Dennis, there's a part you probably saw towards the end of my book where I kind of try to answer that. Now, not in the specific context, of course, of Minneapolis, but it's sort of like, if you do the kinds of things that we're talking about here and putting together the kind of grounding infrastructure, what difference is it going to make when you are there outwardly in witness and in the world, as our friends are right now in Minneapolis, St. Paul? Well, I came up with things like this. First of all, I would say to them, remember that this world belongs to God. That's where everything is starting from. We are against a lot of immediate evil, but we are also there with the conviction that this world belongs to God, and that and that when even when you pray in the Lord's Prayer, like "Kingdom come," what you're really saying is, we want this to be like God is in charge, and that's you start there, and then you have to realize that the work that you're doing, I mean, you're blowing whistles, you're standing in between people, protecting victims against this angry, terrible face of police enforcement. You're trying to help people get groceries. You're doing all the things that people are doing. Well, to remember that at the heart of it, this is really a spiritual engagement. You're doing these practical things, but it's a spiritual engagement, because those passages about how we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers.
Yep.
Those kind of become real. I mean, that's not a slogan. The other thing I like to say is, don't act just on the basis of urgency, because I mean everything's urgent. But you got to act on the basis of call. You have to say, in the midst of all these things, where do I know God is really, as far as I can sense, that God is calling me? And then, all my friends who are in the same, we have the same kind of concerns about the present shape of our country. And their first question is always, what can I do? What can I do? Well, okay, it's a good question. Should I go out and march? Should I sign a letter? Should I write to my congressman? Should I protest somewhere? Well, those are all really, really important questions. But I like to say, maybe the first question to ask is, who am I called to be? Who am I called to be? Because I think we're in a time where we've got to develop the depths of character and spiritual courage and moral grounding that will last for the long term.
Mm-hmm.
That aren't gonna just be temporary. We're gonna need to have real depth of commitment that will breed resilience. And then two other important things that I list and that I would say to myself and say to my friends. You've got to work on being detached from your ego. You can't be in this because you want to see yourself as a hero, or because you're wanting to draw attention to yourself. Because unfortunately, that is the prime model of power in the President of the United States that we see.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't want to mimic that in our way. We want to act differently. And that's a spiritual matter. And with that, I think we have to learn how we don't demonize our opponents, and how we take that love that Jesus taught us, the final step, which is the hardest step, namely to love your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
How, and of course, this is what Dr. King lived out so well. And then I think at the end of the day, we all have to say, where do we root our lives? Are we rooting our lives in anger? Are we rooting our lives in fear? Or are we rooting our lives in love? And are we, in the words of Paul in Ephesians, are we rooted and grounded in love? Because that's a love that is so high and deep and vast, as the passage says, that we can't even grasp it intellectually, but we can know it deep within. Mm-hmm. And that's the love that finally will sustain us, that will eliminate fear, and that will bring us, as I said earlier, into solidarity with all the world's pain and suffering.
When you're looking at kind of things that can ground you, and we've talked about journaling, what other things would people want to consider? If journaling isn't what they want to do, what else would they consider doing?
I think you've got to find the things that work for you and for your personality. Mm-hmm. Certainly prayer. But there are so many ways now of praying.
Yeah.
I think on the Protestant side, we're recovering a lot of the ancient spiritual practices of prayer, a lot of the stuff that the Reformation threw out, that we're now kind of grasping against. So you've got centering prayer, you've got Ignatian prayer, you've got desolation and consolation, known as the Examen. You've got silent prayer. You have in some traditions sort of walking prayer. Walking through a neighborhood with its needs as a prayer walk. You have so many tools where that I think in many ways, at least for me, prayer gets focused much more on presence than it does get focused on what can I get. Mm-hmm. And so in whatever ways work for us, I think we have to deepen that capacity of prayer. And then I think we need to be enriched with words that can help penetrate deep within. And of course, that's going to be scripture, but it may be other writings, maybe other readings. Things that just bring other voices in. And then I think, as we said earlier, developing, however one can, the ability to have a proper kind of detachment from the ferocity and avalanche of all the present the present onslaught of demands and information and the kind of suffocating way in which news just absorbs our whole life. We've got to get some detachment from that in order to really speak with prophetic clarity. One thing that helped me, raised as in an evangelical tradition, was to become much more impacted by the Catholic contemplative tradition and the monastic tradition. I spent I spent about 30 days living in a Trappist monastery on a program that they had. And I was so struck by the discipline that they go through of prayer and of withdrawal and of reflection. And then I thought, most of us are not going to be called to a monastery. We're not going to be called. We're in active life. But, you have to find a way of kind of taking that little monastery with you, that at any point you could kind of retreat back into it when you need to and carry that with you.
Yeah, I think, obviously there are a lot of different ways of how we can do it, but I think there is an importance of how spiritual practices can help to detach you from kind of as you said, the information overload that we are so accustomed to these days, that I think we need, because I think even more so now than maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, is that we receive a lot of information, but it doesn't necessarily tell us anything. And it feels like sometimes what we need is that time to be spiritually grounded, to be able to listen. Because I think all of what we hear doesn't really help us to listen at all. And in fact, it's just, as I think you said earlier, that it's more reactive than it is coming from a more thoughtful place.
Yeah. No, I think you're right, Dennis. We have more information available to us than any other people in the lifetime of humanity. And with AI, we're able to gather more quickly and process more quickly all that vast amount of information. But information is not necessarily truth. It's not information itself doesn't breed insight. It just gives you information. And you need the ability to see through it, to see deep within it, and to not allow it to capture you, but for you to be centered in the way in which you then learn how to filter and how to take that information. And I think that's harder in our lifetime than in any other time.
Well, before we wrap up, I wanted to kind of give you the chance to say something actually to maybe a younger generation that is maybe seeing what's going on in the news. They are people of faith, but they are really agitated by what's going on. What words would you want to say to them as they go out, as they consider what to do, that can help them to be grounded in their faith, and not just kind of reacting?
Yeah. Well, I think first I'd say, Dennis, I'd say to them, remember who you are. Remember who you are. Remember that you are beloved of God. And that is your final source of security and identity. You are the beloved. And from that, remember that each person whom you encounter, in whatever form, whatever posture they're taking, that God is beside them and close to them and wanting to break into their lives as well. as improbable as that may seem, yet every person has within them that image of God, and that God's presence is always there, beckoning and calling them, and beyond all that we do, beyond the slogans we shout and the prophetic calls we plead for, which have to be clearer than ever. But beyond that is the recognition that this world and each person is held in God's presence, and that means your interaction is simply going to be of a different nature. It's going to try to reflect what Jesus said in the Beatitudes. So that because what finally can we give, Dennis? I mean, we can finally offer a different way of living, as imperfect as it is, but doing so, saying we really believe the kingdom is breaking in, which I like to say, we really want to live as if God was in charge of this thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. So if people want to read more, learn more about you, where should they go?
Where should they go? I've got a website that has a bunch of stuff on it. It's West WGM. You could find it. I think that the most. I think, frankly, if someone wants to pick up the book, Soul Work of Justice, 4 Movements of Contemplative Action, you'll discover in it. It's about what I've shared, but as you read into it, you'll see a lot of stuff from my journals. There's a lot of stuff where I'm telling my story, and in some ways, the book's about what we must do for a clear voice working for justice in our time, but it's also kind of my spiritual autobiography. Okay. I think myself comes through. So, I'd say to someone, if you really kind of want to know at least what I am at this point in my life, you read that book, and hopefully you'll get things that are going to help you, but you'll get some glimmers of what I'm all about.
Okay. Well, Wes, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. This has been engaging, I think, and helpful, and I hope helpful to people who are listening.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you for your witness. Thank you for, just the open example of your life, and your following, the way you follow Jesus faithfully, and the way you bring your whole life into the open to do so. I've got great respect for that.
Well, thank you. That means a lot. Thank you. All right. So as always, what are your thoughts about the episode? If you want to let me know, feel free to send me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. I will include links to Wes's website, personal website, and also to his book, The Soul Work of Justice. Also, if you want to know more about this podcast, want to listen and check out past episodes, or make a donation, visit me at churchandmain.org. Also, if you want to read some of my latest writings, check me out at churchandmain.substack.com. If you want to, please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and please consider leaving a rating or a review. That helps others find the podcast. If you want to, another way of making a donation, you can use the link for Buy Me a Coffee, which is in the description. And also there is a link available if you would like to receive the latest episode in your email inbox. That is it for this episode of Church and Main. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. Take care, everyone. Godspeed, and I will see you very soon.